What I'm going to talk about is William Hogarth, who is an English painter and from the 18th century. And I'm going to try and find some sort of similarity with the games industry, so bear with me on this. I think the 18th century is not particularly well known about, I have to say, but it was... let's just turn this thing on. Perfect. But there was profound change going on. There was the union of England and Scotland. There was the 7 Years' War. Here we have General Wolfe beating the French at the Battle of Quebec, after which Canada became British. Also beating the French in India as well, so that became British. We had the American War of Independence. We had the French Revolution. Here we are, the lady flying the flag, liberation. And we had the invention of the steam engine by James Watt, which led to the Industrial Revolution. So profound changes going through the whole of society. And there were also profound changes going on in what we now call the creative industries. It was an age when the public began to see artwork. There was the rise of the middle classes, and they could see artwork in shop windows, in taverns, and they wanted to buy it themselves. And this had a profound effect. It broke down the old hierarchies that had existed. It created new markets. And it also meant that new art forms began to flourish, including a new form of fiction called the novel. The novel was invented around about then. The first novel was arguably Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. But one of my favourites from that time was a novel called The Life and Opinion of Tristram Shandy, which was by a man called Lawrence Sterne, who was a vicar from Yorkshire. And this was really the first non-linear novel. And for those of you who don't know it, and I would have thought that's probably the vast majority of you, it was a wonderful, wonderful send-up. The story jumps around the life of poor old Tristram Shandy. It starts in the middle of his life and then jumps around. And by about chapter 3, we're onto his conception. And his father was a man of habit, we discover at this point. He liked to discharge his duties once a month, one of which was winding the clock, the other one was performing the marital embrace. But he was a forgetful man, and on one particular occasion, he'd forgotten to wind the clock. And at the moment in which he was discharging his second duty, his wife stopped and said, did you remember to wind the clock? And at that point, Tristram was actually conceived. And it said that the shock to his father was such that he blames all his subsequent woes on that unfortunate circumstance. He said, had they duly considered how much depended on what they were doing then, I am verily persuaded I should have made a quite different figure in the world. So, as you can see, there was a lot of innovation. There was a new art form. There were people exploring what their art form could be. But with the rise of these commercial opportunities, so rose piracy. Piracy was pretty rampant. There were laws that had been introduced more recently, but they were ineffective. And then there was also the thorny relationship between the creators of this content and those who were selling it. So there are lots and lots of parallels, and those are some of the ones that I'm going to explore in this talk. But certainly creatively, it was a very, very interesting time on many, many levels. So, William Hogarth. Here we are, the man himself. He was a satirist, he was an artist, he was an engraver, he was a painter, and he was also an entrepreneur. And just as an aside, there's a very good exhibition at Tate Britain at the moment, and they have, people know Roger Melly, don't they? Roger Melly, Viz, wonderful character. They have the various artwork, and then they have a little sheet below with Roger Melly talking about it to Tom, the producer. William Hogarth was born in 1697 in Smithfield, London, and they go on, and then he goes, blimey, doesn't he look just like Ross Kemp? And he does. He does. And it's at that point that Tom shouts, cut! But anyway, it's very, very good. So anybody who's interested at all should go, because it's a wonderful mix between, the old and the new, the lewdness of the 18th century, 19th, 20th century. It works very well. But to put it in context, Hogarth's father, Richard, was an author and a scholar who ended up in Fleet prison for debt. This had a profound effect on poor William. He said later, "I had before my eyes the precarious state of authors of men of learning. I saw not only the difficulties my father went through, whose dependence was chiefly upon the pen, but also the cruel treatment he met with from booksellers." You see, there's a pattern emerging here, isn't there? I mentioned that the new forms of artistic expression were flourishing in the 18th century, and Hogarth hit on a new idea, which was totally novel at the time. The painting and engraving of modern moral subjects to treat my subjects as a dramatic writer. My picture was my stage. And I feel that in many ways, video games are doing the same thing. As has been said earlier, we're a relatively new medium, and in many ways, we're telling moral stories as well in the games that we write. So I'm going to rush through some of the work that he did. His first well-known image engraving was the South Sea Bubble, and God knows if anything changes. How about this? It was 1721. It mocks the South Sea Company, which had been granted a monopoly to trade in Spanish South American colonies in return for taking on the national debt incurred by England's war against Spain. The shares went from £100 to £1,000 in less than a year. Everybody invested. And on the back of this, new companies sprung up. There was one that was famously advertised itself only as a company for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody is to know what it is. And it floated on the market with that. Shares were optioned to politicians, so they were given them at no cost whatsoever, and they could sell them whenever they wanted. So a lot of politicians who jumped out at the right point did very well, others didn't. And it all seemed too good to be true, and of course it was, and it all collapsed. So here we have the merry-go-round that is the South Sea Bubble, and there's some fairly sort of shocking for the time. If you think you've got a whore here, you know, handling the magistrates, you've got, you know, men from the various churches, the Jewish church, the Catholic church, and the Protestant church, all gambling. Here's fortune being cut up by the devil and flesh being thrown out into the crowds. Here we have, you can see that's trade. Trade is dead. So pretty hard-hitting stuff, which was a reflection on the time. And here you have queues and queues of people waiting to get onto the merry-go-round, which is just this goat at the top. So interesting stuff, and very relevant for today, I would say. Next, he did a set of prints called The Harlot's Progress. I'll take you very briefly through and then explain why they're interesting from a commercial perspective. Just to give a little bit of background, this poor young lady arrives in London from the country and is immediately met by this woman who was actually fairly well known as a madam. She would have been recognised, and he had a pretty bad reputation as well. So right from the very beginning, she is on a downward slope. Here she is with a rich gentleman, while her lover escapes and tells the maid not to say anything. And so her licentiousness is leading her finally into prostitution. Here she is in a hovel being arrested by the magistrates as a prostitute. Here she is in prison beating hemp with the other prisoners. You see quite a few of them have little black spots on their head. That's when they had syphilis, and they basically covered it up so that it wasn't noticeable. I thought it'd be fairly obvious. Here she is dying, and when she dies, the others are going through her chest, stealing her goods. And here she's finally died. So a really hard-hitting moral story. But what's interesting is, from a commercial perspective, is that at the time, painters were selling through, there were various monopolies controlling the supply through the production and also through the retailing. And printmakers in particular were jealously guarding their monopoly. Hogarth decided that because he was well known, he was going to try and break that monopoly and sell directly to the public. And this was really unthinkable at the time. He described it himself as still more a new way of proceeding, viz. Painting and engraving modern moral subjects in a field unbroken in the country. He charged a guinea for the paintings. They had to pay half on subscription, half on delivery, and by the end he'd earned a profit of £1,200, which obviously by today's standards is many, many hundreds of thousands of pounds. So it was a hugely profitable venture. He then, based on that, went on to produce the 8 works, which are the Rake's Progress. And again, to give you a little bit of the flavour of Hogarth, I'll take you through these ones very briefly. I very much hope that if you enjoy this, you might actually go and look at them if you don't know them. Here we have Tom Rakewell. His father, who was a total miser, has just died. The servant there is trying to repair something. There's money pouring from the ceiling. There's a cat, emaciated cat going through the silver there. And poor old Sarah, Sarah Young there, she's in tears, she's pregnant. She's holding the ring that Tom gave her, and her mother's furious, and he's offering her a few gold coins to go away. He's not interested in her anymore. So here he goes to become a gentleman. This is here. He's surrounded by people. Here's a jockey who's going to teach him about riding. There's a musician, a composer, an archer, somebody offering to be his bodyguard. But of course, what he really wants to do is go whoring. So here we have one whore here, while another one is actually stealing his watch. This young lady is just getting ready to go upstairs. What they're going to do with that silver dish, I hate to think. But anyway, it leaves very, very little to the imagination. And here he's off to St James's Palace, and he's arrested by the Welsh bailiffs. You know they're Welsh because they've got leeks in their hats. And here's Sarah again, still pregnant, actually giving them money so that he doesn't get arrested. And having, got through one fortune, he then marries this older lady who's one-eyed. Meanwhile, here we've got Sarah carrying the baby, trying to get in, trying to protest. But no, he wants the money, he's going to marry this woman. Finally, he loses a second fortune in a gambling bar. You can see his arm raised in absolute rage. He's lost absolutely everything. So here we come back. He goes into Fleet Prison, which is obviously where Hogarth's father went. So there is a sort of irony to all of this. His now much thinner older wife is berating him, and poor old Sarah, with the young child, has swooned at the shock of it. And finally, here he is in Bedlam, Bethlehem Hospital, surrounded only by lunatics. A couple of ladies look on. That was their pleasure in those days. And the loyal Sarah watches on in despair. So there you go. This is the sort of thing that people in 18th century were buying. I tell you what, it's all got very quiet in here, isn't it? I thought people were going to be up in arms at all of this stuff. So this now cost 1.5 guineas. He put the price up, and it was published in exactly the same way. It was absolutely smashing the business model of the time. He promised it for Michaelmas, which is the end of September 1734, but in November 1734, he issued a notice saying that the work had slipped, since it had found it necessary to introduce several additional characters in the paintings. Now, any developers out there, I suggest that you go to your publishers and say that you found it necessary to introduce several new additional characters, and it's actually 6 months late. However, there was, in all seriousness, a really good reason for this, because pirated copies of his work had significantly reduced his revenues. Piracy was a big, big problem, and it was legal. Now, in 1709, a few decades before, the copyright laws had been passed, but they related only to books.